Hi everyone, and welcome to the 12th of 14 nights of storytelling. My name is Julie Hartley, and I'm one of the directors of Centauri Arts. Um, I said when I started this process that I was wondering whether I would come to the end of my store of stories that actually have happy endings, because I have quite a few that are sort of big epics that I tell, like the story of Boudica and Tristan and Isolde. But they have sort of tragic endings, sort of sad, cathartic but sad endings. And I didn't want to tell any of those in these 14 days. So I wondered how many stories I would have to draw on. Today is day 12, and last night I told the last story I had at my disposal that actually has a happy ending. So tonight's story will be one I've never told before. It's one that I learned today, and tomorrow will also be a brand new story. And then on Sunday night, for the 14th night of 14 nights of storytelling, I'm going to try to tell a story live. So it will not be recorded, and it will be told live on YouTube at 8:30 Eastern Standard Time on Sunday night. So please join us live for that on Sunday evening. There will be the link to our YouTube channel on our Facebook page, which is at Centauri Arts Camp. So you can go there and get the link directly, and that will happen on Sunday night. But for tonight, I'm going to tell a story called The Witch's Treasure. It is an Irish story, quite an old one. It's one I've heard from a few different sources, but never really thought much of until I looked at it closer today and realized it's actually quite a sweet little story. So that's the one I'm going to be telling you tonight. So as always, grab a comfortable place to sit, your friends, family around you, hopefully. And when you listen to this story, bear in mind that you're listening to it with hopefully quite a few other people who are joining us at the same time. So that way it becomes a communal experience, which is what storytelling has been for thousands of years. So, without further ado, make yourself comfortable and remember that I'm telling this story. I'm not reading it. I'm telling it. So, please forgive me if it's not entirely perfect. But hopefully you're comfortable, and we're now about to begin. So tonight's story is the story of the witch's treasure. Once upon a time, in Ireland, a very long time ago, there were two farmers who were very special friends, Pat Murphy and Tom O'Leary. And the two of them had farms neighbouring onto one another, and although they lived alone, they had a great friendship between the two of them. So every day they would go out to their fields and they would work hard. It wasn't easy being a farmer back then. But at night, the two of them would meet down by the river, and as the sun set, they would put their fishing poles in the water, and they would chat, and they would realize that the most important part of the day was the day when they celebrated the friendship they shared together by relaxing on the banks of the river and sharing the stories of their day. Well, there came one day that Pat was walking home from his fields, and he saw a strange creature sitting on the banks of the river where normally he and his friend would sit. And he walked over and he said, "What are you?" realizing that this was not a human creature. This was some kind of a goblin. He was all twisted and small and with gnarly limbs and a funny shaped face. "What are you?" he asked again. "Well," said the goblin, turning to face him, "I am Tom O'Leary, your friend." "What?" said Pat. "You're a goblin. How can you be Tom, my friend?" The goblin said to him, "Well, I'm Tom, and I found a cave today full of witches' treasure. It was by the side of the ocean, and it was a long, deep tunnel into the cave. And when I got to the back, I was about to carry off the witch's treasure so that the two of us could be wealthy beyond our wildest dreams forever. But unfortunately, I cut my feet on magic rocks, and at the point where I cut my feet, I was transformed into this goblin." "Oh no," said Pat. And then he looked again at the goblin and he said, But Tom, why are you sitting with your feet in the river? I've never seen you sit with your feet in the river before." And Tom the Goblin said, "Well, I'm doing my best to wash off the magic, but it's not working. I need your help." "What can I do?" said Pat. "I'd do anything for you, my friend." And Tom said, "You need to find the cave where the witch's treasure is located. You need to take all of the witch's treasure and you need to put it into a big sack. Then you need to row it to the ocean and throw every single piece of it into the ocean. Only when all of the treasure has been thrown in the ocean will this enchantment upon me be lifted." "I can do that," said Pat. "You can count on me. You're my friend. I will lift this enchantment from you." Tom looked at him with care and said, "Please be careful not to cut your feet on the witch's rock as I did, or where would we be then?" Pat promised to do so, and he set out to try to find the cave with the witch's treasure. He hunted along the shore all day, and it was almost night when he found a dark hole leading into the mountainside, leading through the cliffs. And he got a torch and he lit it, and gingerly he walked into the dark of the cave. Sure enough, there were a lot of very sharp rocks everywhere. There was no wonder his friend had cut his feet on them. And just as his friend Tom had said, there was a long tunnel. He went further and further down into the tunnel, and when he came to the end, he saw 3 great doors. The first was a strong door of wood. The second was a strong door of iron, and the third was a heavy door made of stone. "Well, it makes sense," thought Pat to himself, "that the witch's treasure will be behind one of these 3 doors. But how should I know which door to open, and what really lurks behind the other 2? Suddenly he heard a strange noise, and turning around, he saw, sitting on one of the very sharp rocks, a small, ugly little frog. And the frog opened his mouth and instead of croaking started to speak, and he said, "Pat, would you like to know what lies behind those doors?" "I would indeed," said Pat. "I need to know what's behind those doors." And the frog said, "I promise I will tell you what is behind each of those 3 doors, but in return you must promise to give me 1 jewel from the witch's vast treasure." Well, at that point, Pat remembered what it was his friend had said, that every single piece of the witch's treasure had to be thrown in the ocean in order for the enchantment to be lifted. "I can't do that," he told the frog. "I've got to throw all the treasure in the ocean, or my friend will be a goblin for the rest of his life." At that, a strange laughter emitted from the frog's mouth. "Don't believe everything you hear," said the frog. "The goblin you met is no more your friend Tom than I am. What you met on the river today was not your friend, but a powerful water goblin. Let me ask you a question. Did your so-called friend have some part of his body touching the water?" Well, Pat recalled seeing his friend, and he recalled how his friend had his feet dangling in the water, and how he'd said that was because he'd cut them on the witch's rocks. "Yes, he did," he said to the frog. "He had his feet dangling in the water." "Well," said the frog, "that is because water goblins must always have part of their body touching water. It wasn't your friend you saw. It was a water goblin attempting to trick you. Promise me 1 jewel from the witch's treasure, and I will tell you what lies behind each of those doors. You can then get the treasure safely and keep the rest of it, so that you and your friend will be rich beyond compare for the rest of your days." Well, at this, Pat thought hard. "If the frog is telling the truth," he thought, "if I decide to believe him, then I can find all this treasure and we will be rich forever. But what if the frog is lying to me? What if the frog is lying then I have to risk opening each of the doors, not knowing what lies behind them. I could be killed when I open one of these doors by some terrible thing behind them. And even if I survive, well, even if I survive, I would brave any danger to save my friend. He looked at the frog. He had to decide whether the frog was telling the truth or whether the frog was lying. And he decided the danger was too great. Beyond anything else, he had to do whatever might be best to try to rescue his friend. So he had no choice. He had to trust in what the goblin had told him. He had to trust in what his friend had told him and not believe the frog. "You are lying," he told the frog. And immediately the frog leapt up and down in rage. "You are a fool," he said. "You could be rich. I could be rich with just one piece of the witch's treasure, but instead you are letting a water goblin trick you." And at that moment the frog turned into a wizened old elf. "Behind one of those doors," he said, "lies the witch's treasure. Behind another of those doors lies a monster so hideous that it will tear you to pieces. And behind the third of those doors is a black hole that goes on forever, deep into the center of the earth. It will suck you in. The thing is, I am not going to tell you which of those 3 doors you need to open." And with that, the frog goblin, old wizened elf, disappeared. Now Pat was determined again that he would brave anything to help his friend. But he had to think, he had to use his brain. And so before opening any of the doors, he fetched a very long pole. And he covered the length of the 3 doors with the pole. And then he covered himself from head to toe in clinging mud. "Now," he said, "I must choose which of the 3 doors to open first." Gingerly he walked towards the first door, over the sharp cutting stones. This door was the one made of wood. He placed his hand on the handle and he turned. The minute the door slung open, stones were sucked from behind him into the hole behind the door. It was deep, it was dark, and it was powerful. Pat hung on to the rod that he had erected beside the 3 doors. He hung on for all his life, clinging as everything behind him was sucked into the deep dark hole that lay on the other side of the door. Pat waited for all he was worth. He hung on until all of the loose stones had fallen through the door and until the chasm stopped sucking and he was able to grab the handle and ease the door shut using every bit of strength he had. "Wow," he thought to himself, stepping back and breathing heavily. That was obviously not the right door. That was the door with the deep dark hole beyond it. And he was proud of himself that he'd used his brain and hooked the pole at the front of the 3 doors so he'd have something to cling on to. Now, he thought to himself, there are 2 doors left. Behind one of these doors is the witch's treasure that will set my friend free from his enchantment. But behind the other door lies a monster. And he reached for the handle of the second door. This was the door made of iron. He opened it slowly. No monster, nothing dark and hideous, just a great banqueting hall, set with chandeliers in the ceiling. Surely this is the witch's banqueting hall, he thought to himself, and surely over there on the table, that great big chest is the chest filled with the witch's treasure. He stepped inside the banqueting hall, and with every step he took, the slopping mud that he'd covered himself with dripped onto the stone floor of the banqueting hall. He looked around, and hanging on one wall of the hall was a great golden key. He reached for the key and walked towards the table in the center of the banqueting hall. And there was a chest. Surely, he thought to himself, this is the chest that is filled with the witch's treasure. And he took the key and he turned it in the lock of the chest. And carefully he opened the lid. And all at once out from the chest sprang a giant, hideous monster, snarling, snapping its teeth and staring at Pat. And Pat backed off quickly towards the door, but the monster was too quick for him. It sprang at him. It grabbed out at him with hideous fanged mouth and hideous claws. And Pat backed off still further, but not quick enough. The monster grabbed him. But Pat had thoughtfully covered himself from head to toe in mud, and so when the monster grabbed for him, his fingers slipped, his claws slipped, and Pat had the precious seconds that he needed to leap back through the door and slam it in the face of the monster just in time. And he found himself again in the cave, heaving for breath and thinking to himself, so that wasn't the right door either. That was the door with the monster behind, but now there is only one door left, and the third door, the stone door, must be the one behind which I will find the witch's treasure. He looked around him. There was no witch, no frog, no strange, wizened old elf, no goblin. He was all alone, but it was already daylight outside. He could see a prick of light at the end of the tunnel. Right, he told himself, here I go, the third and final door. And he reached forwards and he grabbed the stone handle and he turned, and the stone handle creaked in his hand and the stone door creaked open slowly. And inside was just another part of the cave. But in the center of this other part of the cave was a huge pile of treasure. Well, Pat was so happy that he had to pause to give himself a little joyful dance. And then he reached for the sack he'd brought with him and leapt through the door and shoveled all the witch's treasure into the sack. He was so tempted to keep just maybe one piece for himself. Even a piece of the treasure would have given him and Tom just a great weekend together to celebrate. Maybe a few pieces of the treasure would give them even more. But then he thought of his friend transformed into a goblin. No, he thought, I will do whatever I can to bring my friend back to the way he was. I am his only hope. I must beat this enchantment. And so he looked around and made sure he'd got every last piece of the witch's treasure in his sack. And then he shouldered the sack and he dragged his feet as he gradually made his way out of the cave, carrying the huge load of treasure out of the cave and into the midday sunshine. Now, he told himself, to my boat. I must row this treasure down the river to the ocean, where I will fling it in the deepest, darkest part of the ocean, and my friend will be safe forever. And he did think about the frog a little as he was walking with the treasure down towards the river, and he did wonder if what he was doing was the right thing, and he did consider again and again whether it might be a good idea to take just one or two pieces of the witch's treasure for himself. But he resisted every temptation and instead found his rowing boat and slung the sack of treasure into his rowing boat. And then he heaved the oars up from the side of the river and he started to row for the ocean. Now, as he was rowing, he noticed he was no longer alone in the boat. He turned, and behind him he saw the goblin, his friend Tom. Almost there, Tom, he said, noticing as he looked at Tom that his feet were dangling in the water. Tom, we're almost there. All I have to do is sling all this treasure in the ocean and you'll be back to yourself. His friend Tom nodded and thanked him and looked so troubled by the fact that his feet were so sore from being cut on the witch's rocks. And it's true that Pat thought it a little strange that if his feet was cut, when they reached salt water, he might lift them into the boat, but he didn't. He kept his feet dangling in the water. Don't worry, my friend, he said. We're almost there. You will be back to your old self any minute now. And when Pat reached the deepest part of the ocean, he took the sack filled with the witch's treasure and he emptied it into the water. And he watched as the sack sank deeper and deeper into the water, all that gold and silver, all those jewels, gone forever. And at that moment, the goblin in the back of his boat sprang into the ocean. And with horror, Pat looked back to see the goblin swimming in the ocean and laughing hideously at him. "I'm no more your friend, Tom, than that frog was," yelled the goblin. "I'm a water goblin, and you have just made me rich beyond compare." I'm rich, I am rich," yelled the water goblin, and he splashed up at poor Pat in his boat, and then sank deeper and deeper into the water to his underwater cave, which was now filled with more gold and jewels than he would ever see in his lifetime again. And he left Pat alone in his rowing boat, knowing that he had been tricked and knowing that he hadn't seen the trick coming. And sadly, Pat rowed away from the ocean and back up the river. He went home and he sat despondently at his kitchen table until the time came when he would normally meet his friend Tom to go fishing down by the river, and then, dragging his feet sadly to think of all the treasure that he had lost, he went down to the river to meet his friend. And as the sun set, he sat down beside Tom, and each of them slung their fishing rod into the water, and each of them watched as the sky behind them turned pink and turquoise and every fiery colour that you can imagine as the day was about to end. And Tom listened as his friend Pat told him the story of how a water goblin had tricked him. The sunset was so beautiful, and the two of them fished there together. "You did all that for me," Tom said to Pat. "You made the decisions you made because of me." And they watched as the sun set over the horizon, and they sat side by side by the river, their fishing rods dangled in the water like every other day of the many years before. "We have each other," said Tom at last. "Look around you. See the river, see the sunset, see this moment that we share together at the end of every day. And I ask you this question: what treasure is there on this earth that could possibly compare to this?" That is the story of the witch's treasure. Thank you for listening. That was a brand new story. I've never told it before. And this was night 12. I will see you tomorrow evening for the final recorded tale in this series, and then on Sunday evening live. Thank you all. Have a great day.